She was the last girl on the auction block until a stranger whispered, "I'll take her." The words cut through the harsh desert wind like a blade, stopping every conversation in the dusty town square of Copper Ridge. The year was 1867, and the small frontier town had seen its share of desperate times, but nothing quite like this. Martha Elizabeth Hayes stood on the wooden platform, her chin held high despite the tears that threatened to spill from her green eyes. At 19, she had the kind of beauty that made men stop and stare, golden hair that caught the sunlight like spun wheat, and a spirit that hadn't been broken despite everything life had thrown at her. The auctioneer, a portly man named Silas Granger, wiped the sweat from his brow with a dirty handkerchief. He had been trying to find someone willing to take responsibility for Martha for over an hour. Her father had died in a mining accident 3 months prior, leaving nothing but debts. Her mother had passed from fever the winter before. With no family and no means to support herself, the town council had decided her fate in the most practical way they knew how. "Do I hear any offers for Miss Hayes?" Granger called out again, his voice growing. "She's a fine cook, can sew, and knows her letters. Any gentleman willing to provide for her in exchange for honest work. Before we begin, we'd love for you to watch the story closely, and by the end, rate it out of 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us understand the kind of stories you enjoy, and it guides us in creating even better content for you." The crowd of rough miners, ranchers, and townsfolk shifted uncomfortably. Most of the men were already married or too poor to take on another mouth to feed. The few bachelors present seemed more interested in the saloon girls than in taking responsibility for a proper young lady. That's when he stepped forward. The stranger had been leaning against the general store's porch, his black hat pulled low over his eyes. Nobody had paid him much attention when he rode into town that morning on a magnificent chestnut stallion. He was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of long days under the sun and nights spent under the stars. His clothes were well made but dusty from travel. A black coat, dark trousers, and boots that had seen many miles. "I'll take her," he said quietly, but his voice carried clearly across the square. Granger's eyes lit up with relief. "Well, now that's more like it. And you are, sir." The stranger stepped closer to the platform, and Martha got her first clear look at him. He had piercing blue eyes and dark hair that showed gray at the temples. There was something about him that seemed both dangerous and protective at the same time. "Name's Jacob Thornton," he said, reaching into his coat pocket. "I can provide for the young lady properly. And what exactly are your intentions, Mr. Thornton?" asked Reverend Samuel Morrison, the town's preacher, stepping forward with concern etched on his weathered face. Jacob's eyes never left Martha's face as he answered, "My intentions are honorable, Reverend. I'm in need of a housekeeper for my ranch, and Miss Hayes here looks like she could use a fresh start. I'm prepared to offer her fair wages, her own quarters, and the respect due to any lady." Martha felt a flutter of hope in her chest. She had expected to be handed over to some gruff widower or worse. This man, this Jacob Thornton, spoke like a gentleman despite his rugged appearance. "How do we know you're not some drifter looking to take advantage?" called out Tom Bradley, the town's blacksmith and one of the council members. Jacob reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a leather pouch. The sound of coins clinked as he set it on the platform. "There's $50 there, payment for Miss Hayes's debts and expenses. I own the Double T Ranch, about 2 days' ride north of here. I've got cattle, good land, and a house that needs a woman's touch." The crowd murmured among themselves. $50 was more money than most of them saw in months. Reverend Morrison looked at Martha. "What do you say, child? Are you willing to go with Mr. Thornton?" Martha looked down at the stranger, Jacob, and saw something in his eyes that gave her courage. There was kindness there, buried beneath the hard exterior that frontier life demanded. "I am," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. And so it was decided. Within an hour, Martha had gathered her few possessions, a worn trunk containing her mother's dress, her father's Bible, and the quilt her grandmother had made in, was sitting beside Jacob Thornton on his wagon, leaving the only town she had ever known. The first day of travel passed mostly in silence. Jacob was not much of a talker, but he was courteous. When they stopped to rest the horses, he helped her down from the wagon and made sure she had water and shade. When evening came, he set up camp with practiced efficiency, building a fire and preparing a simple meal of beans and hardtack. "Tell me about your ranch," Martha said as they sat across from each other, the firelight dancing between them. Jacob looked up from his plate. "It's not much to look at yet, but it's got potential. I've been working it for about 3 years now. Got a decent herd started. Good water source. The house, ... double quotes, he paused. Well, it needs work. My wife used to, ... double quotes, he trailed off, staring into the fire. You were married?" Martha asked gently. "Sarah," he said quietly. "She died 2 years ago. Fever took her and our baby." His voice was rough with old pain. "Haven't had much use for keeping house since then. Been living like a hermit, I suppose." Martha felt her heart ache for him. "I'm sorry for your loss." Jacob nodded. "That's why I need help. Not just with the house, but I need to remember how to live again, I think." They traveled for 2 more days through some of the most beautiful country Martha had ever seen, rolling hills covered in prairie grass, streams clear as crystal, and skies so big they seemed to go on forever. Jacob pointed out landmarks and told her about the land, his voice growing more animated as they got closer to his ranch. "There it is," he said on the afternoon of the 3rd day, pointing to a valley spread out below them. Martha caught her breath. The Double T Ranch was more beautiful than she had imagined. The house was a sturdy log structure with a wide front porch situated near a grove of cottonwood trees. She could see cattle grazing in the distance and a barn that, while not new, looked well maintained. "It's wonderful," she breathed. Jacob looked pleased by her reaction. "The house is bigger than it looks from here. Sarah and we planned to fill it with children someday." His voice caught slightly, but he cleared his throat and continued, "There's a bedroom that would be yours. Kitchen's got a good stove, and there's even a parlor with a piano. Though I'm afraid it's probably out of tune by now." As they approached the house, Martha noticed the yard was overgrown, and the porch could use a good sweeping. The windows were dusty, and the flower beds that had probably once been Sarah's pride were choked with weeds. but she could see the potential, the love that had once been poured into this place. Jacob helped her down from the wagon and carried her trunk to the porch. "I should warn you," he said, suddenly looking embarrassed. "I haven't been much of a housekeeper. Place is probably a sight." He wasn't wrong. The inside of the house showed clear signs of a man living alone for too long. Dust covered everything. Dirty dishes were piled in the kitchen, and cobwebs hung in the corners. But the bones of the house were good. The furniture was solid and well made, and Martha could see that it had once been a warm, welcoming home. "Where was Sarah's room?" she asked quietly. Jacob's face tightened. "Upstairs. I haven't been up there since she died. Your room is down here." He led her to a small but comfortable room off the kitchen. "This was going to be the nursery," he said simply. Martha set her trunk down and looked around. The room had a window that looked out over the valley, a simple bed, and a dresser. "It's perfect," she said. Over the following weeks, Martha threw herself into making the ranch house a home again. She scrubbed every surface until it gleamed, washed all the linens, and planted vegetables in the garden. Jacob watched her work with a mixture of gratitude and something that might have been wonder. He was a good employer, and she was discovering a good man. He treated her with respect, never demanding more than honest work for honest pay. He was also surprisingly educated for a rancher, and she learned he had been a school teacher back east before coming to seek his fortune in cattle. "What made you come west?" she asked one evening as they sat on the porch after supper. "Dreams, I suppose," Jacob said, whittling a piece of wood with his knife. "Sarah and I, we wanted adventure, wanted to build something that was ours." He was quiet for a moment. "Her father thought I was crazy for bringing his daughter to this wild country. After she died, he wrote to tell me he'd been right. Do you regret it?" Jacob looked at her, his blue eyes thoughtful in the lamplight. "I regret that she died. I regret that our child never got to take a breath. But I don't regret coming here." This land, it gets into your blood. Martha was beginning to understand what he meant. There was something about the vast open sky and the endless horizon that made her feel free in a way she never had in town. As autumn arrived, painting the cottonwoods gold and red, Martha realized she was happier than she had been since her parents died. She had found purpose in caring for the house and even helping Jacob with some of the ranch work. She had learned to milk cows, tend chickens, and even helped with branding when they brought the cattle in. But more than that, she was falling in love with Jacob Thornton. It happened gradually, like the changing of the seasons. She found herself looking forward to their conversations over dinner, to the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, to the gentle way he spoke to the animals. He was a man who had been hurt deeply, but who hadn't let that hurt make him cruel or bitter. One evening in late October, Martha was in the kitchen preparing supper when she heard Jacob's boots on the porch. But instead of coming in, he seemed to be pacing back and forth. Finally, she heard him climb the stairs. She had never seen him go upstairs before. A few minutes later, she heard the piano. The music was hauntingly beautiful, but filled with such sadness that it brought tears to her eyes. She recognized the melody. It was "Beautiful Dreamer," a song her mother used to sing, When the music stopped, she heard Jacob's heavy footsteps coming back down the stairs. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly. "I went to her room," he said quietly, for the first time since. Martha set down the wooden spoon she was holding and went to him without thinking. She reached out and took his hands in hers. "How do you feel?" she asked gently. "Empty," he said, "but also lighter somehow. Like I've been carrying something heavy and finally set it down." They stood there in the lamplight, her small hands holding his larger ones. And Martha realized that this was the moment everything changed between them. "Martha," he said softly, "I need to tell you something." She looked up into his eyes and saw something there that made her heart race. "That day in town, when I said I'd take you. It wasn't just because I needed a housekeeper." "What do you mean?" "I saw something in your eyes. The same thing I felt after Sarah died. That bone-deep loneliness that comes from losing everything you love. But I also saw strength, courage, and I thought maybe we could help each other heal." Martha felt tears prick her eyes. "And have we helped each other heal?" Jacob's hands tightened around hers. "You've brought this house back to life, Martha. You've brought me back to life. And if I'm not mistaken, this place has been good for you, too." "It has," she whispered. "You have. I know I'm not much to look at," Jacob continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm older than you, set in my ways. And I come with ghosts. But I love you, Martha Hayes. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you make this house feel like a home again." Martha's heart soared. "I love you too, Jacob Thornton. I have for months now." He pulled her into his arms, then, holding her close against his chest. "Will you marry me?" he asked. "Not because you have to, not because you have nowhere else to go, but because you want to build a life with me." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were wed the following spring in the little church in Copper Ridge, with Reverend Morrison performing the ceremony. The whole town turned out for the wedding, many of them amazed at the transformation in both the bride and groom. Martha wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit, and Jacob wore a new suit ordered special from Denver. As they exchanged vows, Martha thought about how different her life was from what she had expected that terrible day on the auction block. She had gone from being a burden with no prospects to being a beloved wife with a future full of hope. After the ceremony, as they stood on the church steps accepting congratulations from their neighbors, Tom Bradley, the blacksmith, approached Jacob with a sheepish expression. "I owe you an apology, Thornton," he said. "When you rode into town that day, I thought you were just another drifter looking to take advantage. But you've proved me wrong. You've given Martha a good life. And from what I hear, she's made quite a woman of herself out at your ranch." Jacob shook the man's hand. "We've made a good life together," he said simply. As they drove back to the ranch in their decorated wagon, Martha leaned against her husband's shoulder and thought about the strange twists that life could take. A year ago, she had been facing the most humiliating and frightening experience of her life. Now, she was married to a man she loved deeply, living in a beautiful place with a future that seemed bright with possibility. "What are you thinking about?" Jacob asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "About that day in town," she said, "when you stepped forward and said you'd take me. What made you do it?" Really? Jacob was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. Honestly, at first it was just that you looked so brave up there, even though you were scared. Reminded me of Sarah when she was facing something difficult. But then when I looked closer, I saw something else. What? I saw a woman who deserved better than what life had handed her. And I thought maybe if I was lucky, you might think I deserved better, too. Martha reached up and kissed his cheek. We both deserve better, she said. And we found it in each other. The years that followed were good ones. Martha and Jacob worked side by side to build their ranch into one of the most successful in the territory. They faced hardships, harsh winters, cattle rustlers, market downturns, but they faced them together. Their first child, a daughter they named Sarah after Jacob's first wife, was born 2 years after their wedding. She was followed by 2 sons, Thomas and Daniel, and then another daughter, Elizabeth. Martha often thought about how strange it was that what had seemed like the worst day of her life had actually been the beginning of the best part of it. She had learned that sometimes when everything falls apart, it's just making room for something better to be built. As she sat on the porch of their home one evening, watching her children play in the yard while Jacob worked with the horses in the corral, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the path that had led her here. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear cattle lowing and the sound of her husband's voice speaking gently to the horses. She was no longer the frightened girl who had stood on the auction block in Copper Ridge. She was Martha Thornton, wife, mother, and partner in one of the finest ranches in Colorado Territory. And it had all started with a stranger who stepped forward when no one else would and whispered, "I'll take her," now that you've watched the full story. We'd really appreciate it if you could rate it out of 10 in the comments. Your thoughts help us improve and ensure we're bringing you the kind of storytelling you truly enjoy.